Hello guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. For this lecture, we're going to begin a three-part lecture on math production. Before we begin our lecture proper for today, I'd just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we were looking at the formal empire, the informal empire of the United States. That is the incorporated and unincorporated territories of the United States as we began to enter the 20th century. We're looking at places like Panama, where in 1903 we would begin production and complete the Panama Canal. We're looking at places like Puerto Rico, which was acquired at the end of the Spanish-American War, and of course Hawaii. Hawaii, of course, was a major draw for the United States. It was a major acquisition for the United States in 1898, and it served as one of the principal coaling stations for American business ships as they traded across the Pacific Ocean to China, to that very valuable China market. And of course, speaking of the early 20th century, particularly during the Theodore Roosevelt years, we're looking at the Great White Fleet, the naval fleet that Roosevelt sent around the world, sort of as an announcement of the United States now in the early 20th century, announcing itself as one of the great powers, or one of the burgeoning great powers. And of course, global trade. Global trade was the main reason for the acquisition of Puerto Rico, the construction of the Panama Canal, sending out the Great White Fleet, and of course the acquisition of Hawaii and Guam, and the Philippines. Those islands were to serve as coaling stations, places where, and back then most of the ships were still using coal for transportation, as a fuel source and also as a heating source. So you needed places where you could stop and not only take on vital supplies like food and fresh water, but also coal, so that you can continue to heat yourself and to travel. And all this was done to facilitate the global trade of the United States, particularly getting into that very rich China market. China and Japan, I should say, but mostly China. China was the big draw at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century for American and also European great powers. Now, to begin with, let's just touch back on monopolies. And monopolies, as we have seen, were the focus of the national reformers, the major industrialists or robber barons, as they came to be known. They themselves were likewise equally focused on industrial improvements. Efficiency had been one of the chief aims of the progressive movement. Going back into the 19th century, the early industrialists like gunmaker Samuel Colt and of course Isaac Singer, the sewing machine manufacturer, these men were among the first to really mass produce industrial goods. And they did them so that they could sell them in large numbers. And they were, particularly Isaac Singer, they were among the earliest to use national advertising campaigns. Now, the first industrial good with fully interchangeability of parts was Albert Overman's bicycle, which became quite popular and fashionable at the end of the 19th century. We're looking at the 1890s with the bicycle really coming into fashion. Now, slaughterhouses in major industrial city centers like Chicago and Cincinnati. These places, these slaughterhouses were really institutions where livestock were systematically brought in conveyors and butchered. And really those slaughterhouses served as the inspiration for Henry Ford. Ford would use the slaughterhouse concept and apply it towards automobile construction very ingeniously. Now, Ford would go on to perfect the production line in 1914, and Ford was also simultaneously able to lower the individual cost of the automobile while raising his workers' wages. And this had the getting a bit tight, Tom. It had the great fortune of making his workers, one, more loyal to him, and also made them potential customers for the products they were making. Now, while this was happening, efficiency experts like Frank Gilbreth and Elton Mayo were developing new management codes by scientifically observing workers. Now, the first industrial revolution had impacted textiles, railroads, the oil, steel, and iron industries. The second industrial revolution was primarily in consumer goods. The early manufacturers who practiced mass production produced almost identical components that would later be assembled into the finished products. They did not enjoy the technological efficiency that would make that would enable them to make all these parts identical. Now, because they couldn't make all those parts identical on the first stop, they had to hire a group of industrial workers known as fitters. And the fitters would construct the units at times by filing down excess matter from their components, from their parts. And once they had successfully constructed one unit, that unit would be deconstructed and labeled. And the finishing touches like painting could be done before the unit was assembled again and sent off to market. Now, Isaac Singer. Isaac Singer in the 1850s rose from humble origins and means to become one of the greatest industrialists of his day. By the 1870s, he was manufacturing close to 1,000 sewing machines a day and selling over 200,000 sewing machines a year. This was partly due to the traveling salesman. Now, it was a common sight in the post-Civil War Republic, and really up until the 1950s, for there to be traveling salesmen, men who crisscrossed the Republic selling goods. Now, to facilitate acquisition of his goods, Singer was one of the first businessmen to introduce the installment plan, where customers who desired his product could purchase the product by making small payments with interest. Singer also pioneered nationwide advertising and corporate franchising. He did this by creating the first showrooms. And these rooms were places where potential customers could come in and view skilled women using his sewing machines. And this allowed the potential customers to question the operators regarding the sewing machines' use, and also to see how to make whatever product they wanted to make, whether it was a pair of trousers or socks, blankets. They can come in and they can view it, they can test it out themselves. It was really one of the great genius moments in economic history. Now, Albert Overman. Overman made the most decisive and innovative breakthrough in mass production. Overman was the first to produce parts that were fully interchangeable. He was able to have each component of his bicycle made to such minute dimensions that any one of the finished products could be substituted for another. It completely eliminated the need to have fitters because all the parts were identical. But as soon as they were produced, they could be changed out. Now, Overman was able to do this because of the improvements to metal alloys and the quality of machine tools. Overman's success enabled him to hold the first bicycle trade show back in 1883. Overman also practiced stratified marketing. That is, he produced very lavish bicycles that he would sell to the very wealthy customers, to his very wealthiest customers, and more modest, homely bicycles that he would sell to poorer customers. Now, Overman first used pneumatic tires for bicycles rather than the old hard rubber strips and ball bearings, which would later prove to be vital improvements for the automobile. Now, the very first bicycle was the Velocipede, and the Velocipede resembled the contemporary bicycle very closely. It was essentially a frame with two tires and a handlebar, and when you look at it, and if you ever operate one, it's a very primitive device. Now, the next generation or improvement to bicycles was the penny farthings, also known as the ordinaries. Now, these bicycles are characterized by having a very large front wheel and a very small back wheel, and they were dangerous to ride. The operator, whoever was riding the bicycle or operating the bicycle, was normally between 4 and 5 feet off the ground. Now, the contemporary bicycle, the bicycle that we know, was first known as the safety bicycle, and it was perfected by the 1880s. And the availability in its modern proportions, it became widely available in its modern proportions by the 1890s. So introduced in the 1880s, and before the mid 1890s, it was pretty much the bicycle that we know today. Now, the safety bicycle was vastly superior to its predecessors and much more safer to ride. One of the early problems overmen faced was the terrible road conditions of the Republic. Now, the majority of the roads in the Republic were dirt roads, and the few major cities that had cobbled roads, those roads were crisscrossed with streetcar tracks, and that posed a great threat to bicyclists. Now, to overcome this, Overman helped support a cyclist lobbying group called the League of American Wheelmen, which served to advocate for better roads and better road conditions. And this really allowed the cycling community to interact more regularly. They gained more impetus as automobiles became regular features on the roads, but the bicycle was important as an invention in its own right. It also led to the development of other inventions. The Wright brothers, for example, the first aviators, they were bicycle repairmen back in Ohio, and they used their repair shop as a laboratory to experiment in. Now, the bicycle also revolutionized transportation in that customers had a more flexible alternative to the automotive. Also, the horse carriage and walking. The bicycle allowed for more timely travel without the constraints of an automobile. Without the constraints of the ironclad timetable associated with rail travel. The bicycle also allowed customers to more freely express their individuality. Now, the automobile will later capitalize on the appeal and the ability to express oneself more openly, but it was the bicycle that first inaugurated this. And really, the first automobiles were available at the time, but early on, the automobiles were really just opulent luxury items that were far too expensive for the average worker to afford. Many in middle management couldn't afford automobiles back in the early 20th century, late 19th century. Now, the prices of automobiles would steadily fall throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, and again, the chief figure associated with that will be Henry Ford, the great industrialist. And we'll break here in our lecture series, and we'll pick up with Henry Ford for our next lecture. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I'll see you guys next time.